Hey, Warrior Saints. Glad to have you beautiful people with us as we continue our conversation from yesterday. So, as we move on, let me tell you something interesting, which is totally going to go in a different direction, but yet not. So, in the defining of who we are, one of the things that I think that to go back to that original part of the conversation from the young adults, the young professionals group, dealing with liberal progressivism. That's what they kept calling it. We never really defined what they meant. They gave it a shot. But anyways, it was interesting. My daughter is a sophomore, as you know, in college and called me like for some, editing and proofing on a paper she was writing because she was in a class. Listen to this. The philosophy of imagination was awesome. And I was a philosophy major undergrad. So, I was hopefully helpful somewhat. And she was having in this paper, she had to write from, an analysis of the professor himself, his book. And I think his name was Kearney. I don't know what his name is, the professor. But he wrote a book called In the Wake of Imagination.
Okay.
And so she had to explore in this paper Jacques Derrida and Jean-Paul Sartre. And which I've read both. I mean, I had to read it in college, but just to say, and interesting. So here's the thesis. Like Derrida, who, these French intellectuals that came from the other side in Europe in the 60s, I guess the 60s, whatever, they started this whole movement. And what the thesis was, at least as I could glean from her paper and her studies, Jacques Derrida said, let's see, I want to make sure I get it right. But his thesis was, there is no reality, no truth. It is all imagination. And where it went was that you can imagine a brighter, I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but you can imagine, the truth is what you imagine. So you could imagine a brighter future. And then here's the challenge, that you can work and do the things necessary to get there. Right? All right. So, and I agree with that. Like, imagine a better future and then go get some, right? That's what we tell our Warrior Saints all the time. But what do you do if that future that you are imagining, you decide is okay to use what others would consider corrupt means to get there? All right. Not to be silly, but low-hanging fruit. What if you're Adolf Hitler and you decide that a more perfect world includes eliminating Jewish people, right? And all the horrible things that they did. Like, most people would say that's unethical. All right. Hitler chose to say that was ethical. And Derrida's statement was this, that you get to decide the ethics, right? So there's no reference for that ethics. So if you have no reference other than yourself and what you decide to be your ethical reference, you could become Hitler like that. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of going to, using their imagination and becoming Hitler, but you can see the hole that this thought goes down. All of that leads to a follow-up convo question. When we've got to solve, what's your identity? Who do you define yourself as? And two, you got to be very careful about the ethics that go with that, or the reference point to tell you what is okay in that identity and what is perhaps not okay. That's a lot. I know. Stew on it. What do you think?
Yeah. I think I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, as far as the ethics goes, that's relativism, right? That's ultimately what the rabbit hole that we go down that leads us to thinking it's all the same as long as you're just a good person, and then I'm the one that gets to decide what it means to be a good person.
Right.
And then, as you do you, boo-boo.
Yeah.
You do what you need to do as long as it doesn't infringe on me. Everyone is free as long as your freedom doesn't infringe on my freedom. And all this stuff that goes on all over the place, that we see all over the place, that we rail against in some ways all over the place, because it really just leads us to, I'm going to go down the narcissism rabbit hole, because that's ultimately what it leads to, because there's no other place for that to go than self-reference.
Yeah.
And once we get to a point where self-reference becomes our MO, our way of living, our general way of doing everything, then we have become the determiner of all things, and therefore we have become the height of everything.
Absolutely. And what if you're broken?
Well,
right?
yeah, but beyond just being broken, we all see the world through filters and we all hear the
Yeah.
world through filters.
Yeah.
And we have to be deliberate about what those filters are. So, first, we have to recognize that they exist, right? And then we have to be deliberate about what we're allowing ourselves to be infused with, so that when those filters are being formed and after they're formed, as we continue to develop those filters, we are deliberate about what we allow into that framework through which we see the world. So let's use framework instead of filters. The framework through which we see the world then becomes infused by whatever we're allowing to infuse it. It becomes so the sponge in the bucket of water,
Right.
right? So whatever we're letting in is how we're going to start developing and continuing this framework. We need to really be deliberate about what we let that be. So as you said, earlier, allowing God's word to be that reference then becomes important. Think about it like this. So we've been talking about the Noah story all over the place and a lot. I'm jumping straight into that because Noah is declared righteous and blameless. We hear that in chapter 9 of Genesis, or chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 9, right? These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That idea, that walking with God, he's declared blameless and righteous. Righteousness meaning he follows the law before there's even a law to follow.
Right.
He's right. He's blameless, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, is his cultic priesthood. That terminology, before there's even a cultic priesthood, before there's any of that going on. And what it really means is that he walked with God, which is what St. Paul talks about all the time, which is what we hear going on and on and on. It's that walking with God. It's that we allow the word of God to saturate our framework, to saturate our filters, so that everything we hear comes from within that framework, so that we're able to actually get out there and do what we really need to be doing.
Yeah, I don't disagree in even one little bit. Not except, but I say the word except to even go backwards a step.
Yeah.
The framework is what you implement after you have decided or chosen who you or what you will identify as.
So I'm going to push back on that because I don't think it's ours to define.
What do you mean?
I mean that it is defined for us, and we have a choice whether or not we live that out. Now, I know I was saying earlier when we start going down the identity politics rabbit hole that we're allowing someone else to define us, and we don't want to do that. But what I'm saying deliberately is it is defined for us in the sense that we are created, as we hear, in that image and after the likeness of God, which then means we are called to build that, to work towards that. Where as we hear in the baptismal service, right? Like we are set on that path in our baptism that is that new life that we hear from St. Paul in Romans. We then have to work and continue to earn it and to continue to work towards that, maintain it. We have to continue to maintain it. We have to continue the work that goes along with doing it. But the choice and where it is us making the choice is we decide whether or not we're going to do that work.
Yeah, I'm going to push on the push.
Good.
Because your statement is correct, but you must first decide whether or not you are going to allow God to be the definer of who you are, the identifier, right? Like, in other words, I mean, for us, I have to, and my teacher used to get mad. You think you have a choice. Well, yeah, we actually have a choice. I mean, unfortunately, I think he's wrong in that God is God. I
Yeah.
get that. But I have the power, especially as a 21st century North American, to decide whether I want to follow him and be aligned with him or not, right? I have the power to choose a completely atheistic, hedonistic, whatever, pleasure-filled life. I can do that. But if I decide that I want to be a warrior saint, if I make that decision that I am going to follow God and do what he tells me and live the life that he tells me and try to be a good Christian and all of those things, then I am not given the right to decide what that looks like. He has, 1,500 pages
Yeah.
of instruction manual, right? So, but the first point is that I need to decide, and this goes all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation today. I choose, and forgive me for speaking about myself, but I do not define myself as a Republican
Mm-hmm.
or as a Democrat or as, I'm neither. Like I said, I'm not registered, but I may define myself humoristically, is that a word? As a Dallas Cowboys fan, whereas you might define yourself as a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But that's not a definition, an identity that rules my life. I define myself, I identify as a warrior saint, period. So what that means for me then is that as a warrior saint, the general of my army is God himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he will give me what you were saying earlier, the modus operandi on how to live. The framework was the word you used, right?
Mhm.
So does that make sense now with all that I'm rambling about? So
Yeah.
you decide who you identify as, but once you pick that identity, then there's a framework that will be given to you. I don't want the full Republican framework, and I don't want the full Democratic framework. Some of it, each of it is nice, but it's not the full framework that I want, right?
Yeah, you want the crucifixional framework.
Totally.
And when you go that route, then there are certain things that you have to do. And there are certain examples of that are laid before us of people who did that and who go and through that. And we see what the results of that are for them. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that your push on my push actually leads us to a place where we're all together talking about the same thing.
I think it's great.
And I think it's absolutely great.
Hey, Warrior Saints, thank you so much for being with us. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and share. It helps us get the word out there. And if you want more, visit us at warriorsaints.org and subscribe to Understanding the Bible. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.